Hey, what's up guys? Nick the Informative Fisherman here. I'm headed out back to do a little early spring reaction fishing on my lake. I'm always hearing, oh, it's too soon, it's too early to throw reaction. Well, I'll tell you what, I start often fishing reaction when water temperature is about 50 degrees early in the spring, that winter to spring transitional time. But there's a thought process that I live by. That's low and slow or stop and go. Let's break it down. So what's one of the first things we should remember when trying to start fishing reaction in the spring? Simple, these fish are just coming out of winter mode. So what does that mean? The fish are hanging out near the bottom. They haven't been chasing baits all winter. They're used to associating to the bottom to feeding. So on a deeper rocky reservoir, that's where I say low and slow. That means let it get to the bottom, work it very slow. If you're used to fishing shallow lakes or river systems, this is where I say stop and go. And I'm gonna try to wrap your head around this. The fish sometimes eat forward in the winter time. That's why a jerk bait often works really well early in the spring. But what happens more often than not is they're still very close to the bottom. Even on grassy lakes, they may be outside the grass lines. They're usually not buried in the grass in the early spring because oxygen's really good in colder water. They don't need that photosynthesis to get that extra oxygen or hide in that grass. And early in the spring, they like the sun. So that's one thing to think about. They don't need to be buried in the grass. They may be actually close to shade lines just for ambush reasons, but not necessarily buried way back in it. So low and slow is what I like for deeper rocky lakes. For shallow systems, I like stop and go. So now let me really tell you what I think about this. For example, my lake here, very shallow, less than 6 feet on average. So we get out there, we're moving down the bank, we're casting. Most of these fish that are right now in this winter to spring transition are grabbing shallow, running deep. So I'm fishing less than 3 foot deep the majority of the time. So let's say I throw a vibrating jig, a lipless crankbait up there, like I throw a rattle trap. And if I'm trucking it along at a fast speed and the fish tell me they're willing to grab it at a fast speed, I can abandon this rule. But usually that is not the case. What I have to do is let it stop, pick it up again, reel it fast, go slow, stop, work it slower. More often than not, the closer it is to the bottom and the slower I'm moving it, the more often I'm gonna get bites. Now, for a lot of people, it is very hard to tell our brain to stop reeling fast. What we actually have to do is, as we're reeling, I tell yourself to stop. And this is what I do all the time. Stop and go, okay? And I'm reeling, I cast it out there, I go, oh, maybe I was reeling it too fast. I'll stop for a second and start going again. And ironically enough, most of the bites this week have been coming on that. I've been catching fish on underspins, on swing head jigs, moving them along fast, and the fish are seeing them, but it's when I tell myself to stop and then I start to go again, it's that little change in cadence that's triggering these fish into biting. And that's just a plain and simple fact. Now there's some interesting ways of approaching this. Like, let's say your fish are on winter mode still more than spring mode. So they're in that winter to spring transition. Well, this is the taper of your shoreline being here, deeper being here. Now, if your fish are more often in winter mode, I say stay boat shallow, cast out deeper, drag your bait up the bottom to the shallow. Now, if they're in spring more than winter mode, you could still stay out deeper and cast up, but I like to get more of an angle to parallel those shorelines coming down. So I'm gonna give you a little tip here. If a bass is very light in pigment, that means they just moved up. So this is typically, if I'm catching a lot of lighter color fish, I'm gonna keep the boat shallow, cast out deeper, let it get to the bottom, and then work my reaction bait up towards the shallow so I know I'm tracing that deeper bottom coming up. If I cast out here and bring it over there, I'm asking the fish to travel too far and they haven't been feeding up all winter long. But if I cast out, let it get to the bottom, now retrieve that bait at that angle, I'm closer to the bottom, I'm in their kill zone. If I tell myself to stop and go, I'm gonna let my bait get back down there. Let's say it's a little bit over their head, it stops, goes, and then they trigger on it, which is what's been happening more so for me lately. Even on the California Delta, that's not a deep reservoir, it's a shallow river system. Out there, I find myself doing the same thing, bringing it down a weed line. I think I'm close enough to a weed line where they should be. I stop, I go, and there's my strike. It just got a little lower. They're following it on the bottom. I was on my buddy's boat using his live sonar. Same thing. A majority of my follows, the fish is literally rubbing the bottom. I see them coming up from the bottom, and when I drop it, that's when they take that sweep shot at it. So I think if you haven't had success with early spring reaction, you probably were not going slow and low, or you were not doing a stop and go enough. Now, there's a lot of really good baits that work this time of year. Thinner baits that don't displace a lot, like a popular reaction bait, spinnerbait in the early spring, works really well. Typically requires a little bit of wind or dingier water. Vibrating jigs like a chatterbait can work remarkably well, but once again, you want to make sure it gets down. So early in the spring, I suggest the heavier vibrating jigs and the heavier spinner baits, just so you know you're down there. Underspins works really great with a soft plastic swim bait on there. BKK Titan, Titan Divers, an awesome one that I use a lot to get down there. Swing head jigs like the Headbanger Rocker Head, let it cast to the bottom, and you can slowly reel it in. If you want to call it a reaction bait or not, that's fine. You may just call it a jig, but it's down there hunting along the bottom. Crankbaits still work remarkably well. You just want to make sure you're digging the bottom and you throw in those occasional pauses from time to time. So that's just something to wrap your head around, guys. Pay attention to that angle. Make sure you're low and slow, or you're doing some stop and go. It's really easy to get road stour out there and just keep moving at that same speed the whole time. But hey, don't get caught up in that. Low and slow, stop and go, lipless crankbaits, spinnerbaits, soft plastic swim baits, underspins, jerk baits, deeper diving crankbaits, even smaller ones, like those smaller cranks that get down there about that 8 to 9 feet. A lot of the time when they're in that winter to spring transition mode, those can work really, really well at the same time. You just want to have some stain to your water. If water's clear, jerkbait's probably going to be your best bet, or a real natural looking lipless crankbait. Last thing, little tip I want to add here for you guys. If you're casting towards the shore and consistently when you hook a fish, if it's shooting towards deeper water, that is a winter to spring transitional fish. So you want to look at that area he's headed. Don't focus on the shallow on your fish finder. Don't neglect a little bit deeper. A lot of those winter to spring transitional fish that are sitting a little bit deeper and still kind of closer to their winter haunts will not actively feed. But if you graph fish out here, that same spot that you caught fish, or that same key piece of structure covered near that shoreline, or the first tree moving up on that transition, or the first ledge, if you graphing fish deeper, chances are they are going to transition up to that zone to actively feed if they won't feed for you out deeper. So if you catch them shallow, they take off running early in the spring. That doesn't necessarily mean they were schooling, although they do this a lot in the spring. So if you catch one shallow, don't keep moving the boat. Make multiple casts in that area, switch bait a couple times, but if they run deep, also check that same area that they ran deep to see if there's more fish, and revisit that same spot an hour later. And I bet you could flip a coin on how many times I went back and caught more fish out of those identical areas, sit there, caught 3 or 4, left it for an hour, came back where I graphed deeper fish in that same zone, and they moved right up there and I caught more, guys. So that's a little early spring reaction bait tips for you guys. So yes, essentially any sort of reaction bait can work like a winter bait if you can get it near the bottom and work it slowly and throw in those occasional pauses. I'm Nick the Informative Fisherman. Make sure to follow me on all the popular social media channels. Thanks for watching.